Welcome to the Impulse Spotlight, a podcast for product development professionals. In this episode, we talk with a born and raised Hoosier about the Sonablate HIFU device, a medical device used to remove diseased prostate tissue. Adam Morris's dad was an IndyCar mechanic for over 20 years, and that allowed him to turn wrenches in the garage on several engines and cars, as well as spend many months of May at the track as a youth. In his downtime, Adam enjoys gardening, canning, fishing, and hunting. Adam is the director of hardware development at Sonablate Corp, a company that specializes in medical devices. Through anecdotal evidence, we gain a better understanding around the importance of taking a top-down approach to product design in order to isolate the general concept before breaking an idea down into the specific requirements and criteria. Additionally, Adam provides a deeper look into the many facets of designing a product, starting with concept designs and researching effective manufacturing processes even before beginning an initial prototype. Then we discuss working through the production process all the way to releasing a product to the general consumer group, and then redesigning elements in order to be medically compliant on a global scale. It's a lot to unpack, so let's get into it. Hey, Adam, welcome to the show.
Hi, Troy. Thanks for having me this morning.
Sure. So to get straight into it, I started Impulse 25 years ago. I worked for a company for about 3 years, and I tell people I got my master's degree in product development there and decided to go start Impulse. How did you get into product development?
I got started while I was still in college. Actually, I was lucky enough to have a small company in my hometown. Walked in the door looking for a summertime job between semesters in college, and they hired me for a part-time floor job. And then I stayed on after I graduated and moved into engineering and product development and ultrasonic transducers.
Very cool. Very cool. What's your current role? What kinds of products do you develop?
Currently, I'm with a different company. I'm a medical device company called Sonablate Corp. I'm a director of hardware development. So in the medical device industry, that entails a lot, of course. And the product we make is our primary product is a prostate tissue ablation device for helping treat prostate cancer and benign prostatic hyperplasia, or BPH, which is very common in all men.
Is that the product you want to talk about today?
I'm going to talk about the probe and the probe housing that we have been kind of developing and kind of refining over the last few years.
Okay, tell us more about that then. Like, what are why'd you choose that product, and what are some of the key features or innovations about that product?
Mainly because of the requirements. The probe is designed to be held by an arm, but is inserted transrectally into each patient. So it has to be safe to have that done. And because we use ultrasonic waves, we have to be able to directionally point the beam to where we want to treat tissue. So because of its use, we have to make sure that we're mechanically robust. We have to make sure that we're chemically robust, and we have to make sure that we're thermally robust because of how this is used and reprocessed.
Very interesting. This is probably going to sound like a rhetorical question, but hopefully you can give us some detail off of it. But were there any novel technologies, materials, methods that you guys used or discovered when you developed this product?
Back when we started the project originally, we had to do a very robust analysis on not only the design and mold flows and that type of thing, but we had to do multiple matrices on selection based on all those properties that I just named, the thermal properties, impact strengths, these things. Reprocessed medical devices are abused by the reprocessors. They don't care. It's like a UPS package going into the warehouse there. So yeah. It has to be robust. has to be able to be handled, has to be able to see different water wash downs, different chemical compositions ranging from soapy water, alcohol, or other sterile wipes that might be used to clean off residue, and then go into cleaning solutions that can be anywhere from alkaline to acidic, mildly acidic, all the way to strong oxidizers such as hydrogen peroxides and ethylene oxide.
Wow, I assume that selection process was quite involved then. Took a long time.
Yeah, I mean, collecting data. When we started this, of course, so many new materials come out each year. But when we started this, there were several new intermediate engineering resins that had just come out. PSU had been out for some time, probably a dozen more years. Altum PEI had been out. And we were looking for something with a little better chemical resistance and a little better impact strength than those resins typically offered. And we basically ended up with PPSU, or a material trade name called Radel. There's some generic ones out there as well that has a good compromise between cost, impact strength, durability, chemical resistance is excellent, and thermal properties, of course. It's a high heat, high glass transition temperature.
Very cool. Very interesting. So we've helped design literally thousands of products, and every one of those product development journeys is different. So walk us through kind of the journey of developing this product. Like, what were the steps involved?
Okay, so typically with a medical device, you kind of got to do a little bit of market research, know what people are using in their hospitals or the surgical sites, what they're using for cleaning, disinfection, what's approved by the FDA for use for different things, and or sterilization, and try to hit the majority of those in your initial run. It's hard to validate every chemical out there or every process out there.
Sure.
So we start out with kind of a requirements document, and say, okay, what do we have to do? Our original design was a cast product, and of course, a lot of variation in that process when you start trying to go to any volume. So we had leaking issues. Our processes, some of it is dunked in liquid hydrogen peroxide solutions. Hydrogen peroxide leaks in and corrodes everything because it's an oxidizer. Little bit less impact strength, so we're having cracked housings or other things occurring. Seal failure was the main thing, so we came up with this interim solution of sealing everything up with silicone, RTV silicone, just to get us through. But that, eventually with those chemicals, that breaks down as well. So we finally made the investment and said, hey, we need to go to something that's going to be reproducible even at low volumes, relatively low volumes, a few hundred a year, with a good, stable resin. So we said, okay, here's the concept. We're going to go to an injection molded. Here's what tooling's going to cost. Here's what, here's the project timeline. Here's the resource needed. So we kind of developed that whole requirements, and here's why we're doing it. Here's our target markets and our ROI, and sell the product, get a management buy-in, and so forth. So once we have that, then we say, okay, let's mock it up. Let's do concept prototype. And in our case, and because of the expense of doing a big part, this probe is about 30 inches long. The housing's like 3 inches by 8 inches by 25 inches, roughly 24 inches, 4 pieces. So multiple seal. I think I counted 10 seals in this thing for those 4 pieces to be joined. Some critical dimensions. So we have to machine it post molding because of part shrinkage and stuff, and diameters needing to be round. Not, you don't always get that on big parts. So we have to kind of undersize some things or oversize other things, and then finish them after molding. So what we do is say, okay, this is going to be a big investment. Let's mock this thing up. So we usually start on these types of projects with the 3D printing process. That has been a godsend over the last decade or so with product development. I think everybody in product development, I think, knows that now. So
Yeah.
doesn't always get you to your final product. For injection molding, usually some tweaks have to be done, but depend on resins and processing parameters. So once we get through prototyping, then we'll move on to a full-scale development and say, okay, fit, function, look to be there through the 3D printing process. Then we'll say, all right, let's cut a tool. So cut the tool, prototype, check everything, refine, work with the molder, refine everything, and then cut her loose. In this case, we do, build some prototypes, do some engineering verification and reports and so forth. And then the process is, okay, you did all this work. Now you got to take 5-10 probes and run them through a controlled, usually at a lab that's certified, and validate your processes now. So in our case, in the US, we're validated with this design in ethylene oxide, which is good, but going away. There's some environmental issues and health issues with ETO, and they're trying to cut it back. We're working on getting certified into vapor hydrogen peroxide, and then we're certified with some liquid disinfectants and validated in those. Liquid hydrogen peroxide and some enzymatic cleaners. And then typically, once you validate a process, one technique, you basically, in your IFU, state how you validated, because not every facility will have those particular chemicals on, and they may say, hey, we don't have this, but we have this. Is it compatible? And we can usually do an analysis for them and say, yes, you should be okay. It's similar to this. The chemistry's similar or whatever. It's very hard for these places to get new chemicals in. So you have to be kind of flexible, but we see a broad range of things. One of the things that occurred in this particular process, we were about halfway through it, certifying the tools and the molds, and our customers in Europe don't use ETO, didn't like our disinfection process, and said, hey, we're all going to these automated washers, and they're different. Some of them are cold chemicals where they just step through a cleaning, a rinse, a disinfection cycle and a rinse, and a disinfection cycle and a rinse, and then dry it off. Mm-hmm. Other ones use a thermal cycle that uses cleaning, disinfection, sterilization cycles, and each stepping up in temperature. That presented a whole new issue that we had to tweak the design. We didn't have to redesign, but we had to tweak some things, because now in these automated washers, we had to be not only dunk proof, we had to be essentially pressure proof, because of the thermal gradients would cause all the expansion on the seals that we didn't originally design for. We designed for ambient temperature, and all of a sudden we got to be able to go to 70 C and maintain seals. So and with long sections of thin-walled plastic, those things are moving, right? Like a bellows. So we had to do some work there. So those curveballs always come, seems like in a big project like that. But so we get through all that validation, and then you're at the point where you can say, okay, we're ready to transfer this to manufacturing, train them. You go through the process validation with the manufacturing group, and then you're ready to release the product to the general sales population and get it installed, and service team so they can retrofit systems out in the field if the customer so desires, that type of stuff.
So when you go through that validation, before it goes over to manufacturing, is that basically like FDA approval type stuff? Or is it you're just kind of your theories?
It depends on the registration site. Like, we're approved in 50 countries worldwide.
Okay.
Some of them, most of them are common, but not quite the same, especially the big markets. They have their own little twists and turns to them. And you still have to get individual approval. Now, Europe is the CE mark. So we have the CE mark. FDA, China, Taiwan, Brazil. I mean, all these big markets, and they all have their own little twist on things. So typically you have a filing with each jurisdiction you're in that you have to update with the information when you do a project like this. You don't have to resubmit per se, but you have to maintain all those records as a change notice with all the reports. You get audited, you make a change to your tech file like that, they come in, you do your audit, they come in and say, hey, I want to look at this. So you better have your I's dotted and your T's crossed.
Yeah. Wow. So what did the timeline look like for developing this product?
Originally, because of the prototyping and the mode development and tweaking, we originally had about a 2-year timeline, 2.5-year timeline on it. It ended up with that change right in the middle of it, actually almost toward the end of it. We were pretty much almost done with the project, moving into validation. We ended up having to do some tweaks to design, which we had to redo some other things and get some testing done in Europe because of the types of devices, the auto washers they use over there. One of the caveats with our system is the probe tip, what we call the probe tip, where the ultrasonic transducer has circulating water bath around it. So it's dressed with a sheath, sealed, and then there's cooled, degassed water circulating. Those water lines for that run through the probe housing and into the what we call the probe tip, the distal end of that probe where the transducer is. So the challenge has always been when you were disinfecting, because that's essentially in what we call the patient interface, that has to be disinfected or sterilized each time. And that is the most difficult area to do it. So when we went into these auto washers, they're like, okay, so how do we clean these tubes? And basically I said, well, you got to hook up lines to them. I said, oh, we have endoscope lines here that you can hook right on. Nice. So they can effectively do this in that process. With gaseous processes like hydrogen peroxide, especially because hydrogen peroxide, you think, oh, well, that's a liquid. I buy that at the drugstore in a bottle and it's liquid. Yes, under certain conditions, very controlled conditions, you can vaporize it. But because it's an oxidizing gas, it interacts with different materials different ways. So with Teflon, stainless steel, no problem. It can go long, 1 millimeter diameter orifices for 1 meter. No problem. You change that to PVC, done. You can't do it. It won't do it. It reacts, messes up and the gas starts condensating back into liquid in the process, and you can't do your sterilization. So it drives material selection in other ways, these processes. The manual method that we use in liquid research requires us to have a syringe handy where they actually draw liquid out of the bath and shoot it down these water paths to be able to and then tie it off and let it soak for a few minutes and then do it again, flush it and do it again. So you kind of passing through a circulation mode there as this thing disinfects. So each of them are different and require different things. So we have to kind of analyze, okay, which process, and then how is our probe going to be able to survive or work with that process.
Yeah. How much time did that end up adding to the project, having to work with the washers and all that?
Oh, it varied because it came up at different sites at different times. But overall, about a year to get tested, because several sites, and they use different types of washers. So
Yeah.
it presented a challenge to get in there and get them tested, and okay, this works, and get their people to sign off on it as well. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. So tell us a little bit about your team. How many people were involved and what were their roles?
typically, a project like that's going to involve, one or two design engineers, um, doing prototypes and the CAD work, and doing the 3D printed prototypes and building mock-ups and testing function, make sure we don't mess up linear motion or rotary motion, or how the thing senses temperature, or how water flows through that probe tip. All of that stuff, has to be checked and validated, make sure verified, make sure it doesn't, we don't impact that with anything we're doing. So typically, two people plus your project manager, which is typically me. And then as we get through that verification, typically a quality engineer would be involved to sign off and make sure we did, hey, yeah, you met this, and all that looks good. Then once we move to validation, and we start talking about manufacturing, finished tooling, and that type of stuff, you're pulling in quality control people, you're pulling in manufacturing, service teams, clinical teams, to all kinds of members. So you can end up with a cross-functional team with a dozen people on it for a project like this, because you got instructions for use that have to be written by the clinical team, service procedures by the service team. How do we build it out on the floor in manufacturing? So all those people have to be involved. And then how do we test it? How do we verify it? QA is not going to sign off until you have a way to verify that it's doing what it's supposed to do every time. So we have special tests in manufacturing, pressurized dunk test, leak test. I mean, all kinds of things to make sure every unit is sealed properly. So.
Very cool. With all the products that Impulse has developed over the years, there's always been some kind of challenge that comes up. And I know you've mentioned a few, but I'll go ahead and ask the question anyway, just in case there's another one. What was the biggest challenge you and your team faced developing this product?
The injection molding models, because of how big the parts were, like there's two halves, there's two end caps, but then there's two halves that mate in the middle. And you got thin walls, and then they've got a draft in opposite direction because of the way the cores had to be pulled on the molds. Mm-hmm. So you got this draft, and then you got this joint in the center of this. That's, each of those parts is about 8 inches long. So every one of those has to come in with a certain dimension and a certain maximum bow on those length of those sides, so that seal that's in the center of those, when those two meet, we've got kind of one seal that seals on two surfaces. So we have kind of a redundancy there as a backup, and it has to fit just so, or you won't seal consistently. Yeah. And that was the hardest part, and is I think really the whole thing. The rest of it's all mechanical, it draws down together, but having that draw down parallel and consistent over that seal, and that seal every time was probably the hardest part of that whole thing.
But was it just a lot of tooling revisions to get it to end up
and their process control of how they, how fast their cycle time goes, what temperature, what pressure they're shooting at, that type of stuff. If they got that dialed in pretty good, the batch will run pretty good, and we won't have any issues.
Cool. Interesting. You mentioned earlier 3D printing. Were there any other kind of prototyping processes that you employed during the development?
Depending on the type of device, we may use cast parts. That's kind of expensive to build a tool, because you got to build a negative anyway. And then, of course, machine parts. Typically that, if it's reasonably simple. Now, with 3D printing, the thing I like about 3D printing is you can do things much more complex than you can necessarily do in one part, and that may take 2 or 3 parts, and machine parts going together or cast parts going together before you go to injection mold. And 3D printing has proved, that with the right setup and the right design, it's actually pretty cost competitive into the low thousands in volume now. So it's
I've actually, there's a client of ours recently moved a pretty big part. They're 100% 3D printing it for production now. So
yeah, and the materials that are available is expanding rapidly. And
that
our
was the reason
problem is
he moved
usually
to the production was he can use carbon fiber. It's a PLA with carbon fiber in it, so it was very cost competitive for him.
Yeah, resolution was an issue most of the time. Everything looked really rough and stuff, but some of the printing methods they got now are getting down to resolutions of 1 to 2000. You can't even see, the roughness. The roughness goes away. We're having our probe tip, what we call our probe tip. We're actually working on a 3D printing process for it. It's currently a cast part. It can't be injection molded or machined. So it's like it's cast, and it's very expensive and very complex. And with 3D printing, we can do a lot of things we can't do with a cast or machined or injection molded part in how we handle water pass and other design details that make the system, the tip, more efficient. And it's almost a cost factor of 10.
Are you
Better.
do you have internal 3D printing, or do you send all of that out to vendors?
No, we don't currently have. Some of our engineers have their own little personal printers, but and kind of will play around with prototyping stuff if they so desire. Typically, we outsource that currently because the methods and the materials we need are almost engineering resin type, and that's a expensive machine that we're not really. With the volume that we're doing, okay, what's the payback? You know how that goes.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, just to kind of start wrapping up, what are some of the trends that you kind of see emerging in product development?
The improvement of CAD, modeling software, digital twins, and virtual type interfaces. I think those are going to become big. Eventually, you might see some impact from AI in this industry. It's being used in medical a lot for diagnostic applications, but not really for like what our product is, where we use sound to treat disease. It's hasn't really made an impact by any, even in the research realm, hasn't really made an impact there. But on the diagnostic side, it's making huge impacts. And then, of course, the continuing evolution of 3D printing. When right now, the last trend line I saw for 3D printing was cost competitive up to the point where you're at 2,500 parts a year or something. And then you should go to injection molding. If it's moldable, figure out how to do it. I think that number is probably approaching 5,000 a year now to go through because of the size of platforms they can print on and the heights that they can print on with great accuracy.
Sure.
I know this probe tip we're working on, they can print 12 at a time on the thing. Well, that's 1 month's production for us. So, it's for that, it's great. We got other applications where we're looking at a 3D printed part that'll be in the thousands. So it's how cost effective. I think that's going to be the inroad as they drive. They're going to become more and more cost effective against other high volume techniques like injection molding or other forms of, even on the metal side, the printing is becoming really good.
I've seen some applications where people are printing 3D and then they'll just like a cast part, and then they'll go machine anything that's critical. And it's in production. So,
Yep.
If you could go back and change one thing about developing the product you've been talking about, what would it be?
And fortunately, this one's just come back to the forefront. So at the time, we didn't have the resources to do this. Would have been a major overhaul and maybe some redesign of some of the internal frameworks on the probe, and the appetite wasn't there for it at the time. Would have been a much bigger, longer program, involved more resources. But as I mentioned before, the probe housing currently is 4 pieces. It has an end cap, 2 middle housing parts that are fairly substantial in size, and then what we call a collar that actually screws down on the internal frame and kind of compresses everything together. Mm-hmm. When we started endeavoring into that project, it was like, why are we doing this? This is how we're having it cast, because that was kind of the limitations of casting at the time, was to make that whole thing, except for the back end cap, one piece, redesign it a little bit so it still fit the internal, but eliminate and consolidate 3 parts into one. So we only have an end cap where the cable connects in, and then one housing with seals in it that slides over, and we don't have to worry about seals at the front. We'd eliminate 6 seals, I think. We'd end up with 4 seals maybe in the whole thing that way. Of course, tooling investment's a little more for a big piece like that, but it would have made life easier for manufacturing, service, development maybe would have been a little bit. There's other issues we'd have to resolve, but that was probably the biggest issue we wish we could have done at that time.
So reflecting on, you've done this a couple years, so reflecting on all the challenges and successes and everything you've encountered developing products, what words of wisdom would you share with those looking to make a significant impact in the product development industry?
Look at all your problems from a holistic view. Try to get a top level view before you get into the dirty details. And once you kind of get that holistic view, and that's kind of like, okay, from the clinical side, they're saying, from marketing side, they're saying, from all these different inputs, okay, from a cost impact, from a function impact, try to pull all that into a high level view, and then break down and get those requirements defined really well, and then lock it down. The biggest disruption to any product is resources, finances, or a change in requirements.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, Adam. This has been great. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to mention with regards to the product or product development in general?
Sure. If you're interested in knowing what Sonablate does, or what they can do for anyone that might have a prostate issue, we have over 50 sites, pushing 75 sites alone in the U.S., 3 here in central Indiana that use our system. Check it out at sonablate.com.
I will. I'll put that website in the show notes, and everybody go check them out. So, Adam, right. I appreciate you being on.
All right. Thanks for having me, Troy. We'll talk to you soon, I hope.
To learn more about Impulse and how we might be able to help you, visit impulseproductdevelopment.com.